Hi, I'm Bianca Fernet, and welcome to the first episode of Fernet with Bianca, where we are going to be discussing Argentina's economy with prominent Argentine economists that have an opinion on what's going on in the country today. So I'd like to welcome my guest, José Luis Espert.
Hello, Bianca. Nice to meet you.
No, it's nice to meet you too, and thank you for coming in today.
I'm not a prominent economist. I am only economy. I studied a lot. I work very hard, but I'm not a prominent economist.
Well, you know, the people that'll be watching us today maybe don't have as much knowledge about the prominent Argentine economists. Therefore, to them, you've come up to be the most prominent, I'd say. So,
no, I don't think so.
So congratulations.
Okay,
Argentina's
thank
most prominent economist here to talk with me today. And what I wanted to discuss today is the idea of, is the dollar too cheap? So Argentina is constantly in international news about inflation and what's going on with the exchange rate. But going sort of to a more basic level about what makes up an exchange rate, which is somebody taking one currency, so in this case the Argentine peso, and buying US dollars. Is the dollar too cheap?
You know, Bianca, in general, in economics, the issue about an economic variable, when you tell that this variable is cheap or not cheap, is a misconception sometimes, because when you say that the dollar is cheap, you have to have clear the notion that there is an equilibrium exchange rate which is very far from the observed level of the dollar.
Okay.
For example, when you say the dollar is cheap, comparing with what?
Yeah, so that's one of the things I was curious about.
One way to analyze or to perceive if the dollar is very cheap or not cheap is looking at some numbers. For example, when you see the people in Argentina traveling abroad to Paraguay, to Chile, to buy the same things that they can buy in Argentina, perhaps this is an indicator that the dollar is cheap. Another indicator that the dollars could be cheap, maybe cheap, is for example, the private employment is stagnating in the last 5 years. This is another indicator that perhaps you have a misalignment in your dollar. The dollar is cheap.
Okay, so what we have here are sort of two concepts. We have Argentines as consumers who make a decision to take what I can assume is not the most vacation-esque road trip over to either Chile or Paraguay to go and buy groceries or clothing for their kids. Electronic products, because it's actually worth 2 days worth of time, plus the amount you're going to spend on fuel, plus all of the other costs to take that trip and use those pesos to essentially buy dollars, and then use those dollars to buy goods abroad. And then the second concept that you brought up was that private employment or growth in the, when you say private employment, do you mean how many new jobs there are in the private sector?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. When the dollar is cheap, companies every time, despite of Argentina is a very close economy against international trade, but anyway, private companies are competing with other companies in the rest of the world.
Right.
So when the dollar is cheap, your labor costs, your salaries are very difficult to pay with this cost in dollars.
Okay.
So this is the reason or the connection why perhaps you would have a very cheap dollar when private employment is not growing very fast.
Okay, so what you have is a case where if the dollar is cheap, the sort of corollary of that is that the peso is expensive.
Expensive, exactly.
And so
the cost of living in Argentina right now is very high comparing with Brazil, with Chile. Is very near some developed countries.
Yeah, so let's go into that. So what is, when you look at sort of the exchange rate or sort of the lack of an equilibrium between the two currencies, the main topic or sort of the most sort of associated economic word with Argentina is inflation. You know, Argentina has high inflation, and this year, or 2016, was a real, you know, was a real kick in the balls for inflation. I mean,
Yes.
the cost of office supplies to food has gotten so high.
So high.
And like you said, even compared to cities like London or New York, you know, even, you know, compared to Brazil, compared to our neighbors. So, what's the relationship between the exchange rate and inflation? Does one affect the other, or which sort of comes first?
The economic science has proved so many times that the inflation rate is a monetary issue, is a monetary phenomenon. In the long run, it is impossible to have a very high inflation rate if you are not printing money.
Okay.
If you stopped printing money, you can be sure that perhaps after 1 year or 2 years, you will have a declining in the inflation rate.
Okay.
But in the short run, perhaps factors like a devaluation in your domestic currency would affect the inflation rate. One of the reasons why during the last year, 2016, we have had an inflation rate very near 40%, is due to the exchange rate at the end of 2015, very near 50%.
Yeah, I remember that was it was the sort of the realignment. So when we stopped pretending the peso was worth 10 pesos
you
to
know,
the dollar.
after this huge devaluation, after this big devaluation, the real exchange rate, the purchasing power of the dollar right now is very near December 2001.
Okay.
You know, in
what do you mean by the purchasing power? Or if I'm just a consumer.
The real power of the dollar to buy things.
Okay.
The real power of the dollar to buy things now is very near the power of the dollar to buy things at the end of December 2001. And in this year, in these times, 15 years ago, more than 15 years ago, nobody has doubts that the dollar was very, very cheap.
Right. So that was sort of, so you're talking about purchasing power right before, you know, the one of the biggest currency crises in modern history, when Argentina devalued from essentially a 1-to-1 to 4-to-1 overnight, and there was the Corralito, whereby Argentines lost their savings by 75% in an instant. But so going back to what you said earlier with inflation being part of monetary policy. So when we look at an economy, we've got sort of, as a government, the government has two tools at its disposal. It's got monetary policy and fiscal policy. And so fiscal policy is where we have Congress and we have spending programs and we have taxes and things like that. And then monetary policy is where we have the central bank that sets inflation rates, and we have the central bank that sort of participates in buying and selling bonds and other monetary instruments. So going to the monetary policy part, because I think that's the one that non-economists have there's the most room to clarify. When we talk about the dollar being cheap right now, one of the things we've also seen happen over last year is the central bank's interest rate is close to 25%, and that's remained roughly stable all of last year.
Yes.
What do you think? How much of a impact does having such a high interest rate? So for comparison, the U.S. interest rate is 1.5. It's low, but you know, even in comparable countries like European countries, Australia, you don't see an interest rate above 8 or 9%.
Now, you know, the central bank in Argentina has decided an inflation rate target. So when you have a regime called inflation rate, the central bank fixes the domestic interest rate to avoid an increased inflation rate, or to avoid a crisis in the inflation rate.
Right.
So that is the main important reason why during the last year we have had interest rate very near 25%.
So if let's say that tomorrow, this is not a policy instruction, but as sort of like an economic exercise.
No, perhaps we have to connect for the people.
Right. What's the
the relationship
there?
between the Congress, where a politician decides the public expenditure, the fiscal deficit, and after you have a fiscal deficit, you have to finance this fiscal deficit. And one way to finance fiscal deficits is the central bank printing money.
So
in Argentina,
let's connect
Treasury call the president of the central bank and tell him, please, I need 100 million of pesos to pay the bill for the following 2 months.
Okay.
This has not happened in United States or in Europe, but in Argentina this happened.
So is it still, I know that one of the major sort of, the major criticisms of the former administration was essentially this lack of independence between fiscal policy, which is how much Congress spends, so that's social programs and things like that, and the central bank, who decides how much money to print and where to set interest rates. Has the Macri administration put that separation back, or are we still seeing essentially a fiscal policy that's then being compensated for by a central bank that, rather than focus on an equilibrium exchange rate, prints money to pay for overspending?
You know, in the last half century, Argentina is making circles in fiscal policy and monetary policy. During a period, you have fiscal deficit financed with the central bank printing money, and after you have a crisis with inflation rate caused due to printing money, you began to finance the fiscal deficit printing debt.
Right.
No? After you have a default or a crisis with external or domestic debt, you began to print money at another time to finance the fiscal deficit.
Okay.
So in Argentina, fiscal deficit is not negotiable.
Right.
No? Everybody, in general terms, agree that the government needs to have a huge fiscal expenditure, a huge fiscal deficit, and you change the way to finance this fiscal deficit depending with the crisis, with the previous crisis.
Okay.
Right now, Macri has decided to avoid a crisis in the inflation rate at the end of 2015, and after that, they began to reduce the inflation rate, beginning to reduce the velocity of the printing money.
Correct.
And they began to print debt and external debt, internal debt, to finance the fiscal deficit. But the fiscal deficit right now is bigger comparing with the last year of the Kirchner administration.
Well, and looking at sort of there's what we're talking about.
I'm clear.
Very clear. Okay. Very clear. And so bringing that to sort of the idea that a lot of the fiscal deficit comes from paying things like energy subsidies, which are dollar-denominated purchases. So in order to essentially for the government to acquire or to subsidize or to finance some of its expenditure, we're talking about dollar-denominated purchases. So how does a cheap dollar impact the government's subsidizing or financing things that have to be acquired abroad?
Here you have two different things.
Okay.
One thing is the government issuing external debt, which put additional pressure for this cheap dollar.
Okay.
No? The government financing the fiscal deficit in that way increased the problem with the cheap dollar. But the other issue that you pointed out is fiscal deficit and the connection between subsidies and the fiscal deficit. Yes. You know, it is wrong to reason that the fiscal deficit is due to subsidies.
Okay.
No. First of all, you have to analyze public expenditure.
Okay.
No? after that fiscal revenues, and after that fiscal deficit.
Okay.
You know,
so what
because
we're
if
saying
one
is
way-
we look at, just to kind of make sure I understand the concept. So we've got the fiscal
No,
deficit.
I'm not saying that you have a misconception, no, but because here in Argentina, this is a general misconception.
Okay.
No? Because public expenditures or subsidies are right now very near 0.3 trillions of pesos.
Okay.
Pesos.
All right.
Trillion is your measure in the United States.
It's
Okay.
it's the
Zero
billions,
po-
billions, millions,
0.3 trillions
Yes.
denominated in US dollars, no?
Okay.
But in pesos.
Right.
Because here in Argentina we would say 0.3 billion of pesos, but billions in our domestic currency.
Right. No, that's one of those language. It's also the
How do
billion.
you prefer to speak?
Uh,
Billion of pesos or trillion?
let's talk about billions of pesos.
Okay.
But so going back to sort of the core
Okay.
concept here, when we look at then the cheap dollar, and we have had a year of Macri's policies now. What happens then in 2017? So going forward, what steps should the government take to reach an equilibrium exchange rate? And would those steps have an impact on sort of growth versus political stability?
Well, I think that the most important measure that the government needs to take to avoid a cheaper dollar is to liberalize imports.
Okay.
In Argentina, still we have a very close economy. In 2015, Argentina lost a trial in the World Trade Organization due to the measures that Argentina has taken during 10 years between 2005 and 2015.
Yeah, there was a lot of non-tariff barriers.
Yes,
so
a lot. If you need to make an import, you have to go to the government.
you got to get the guy that has the stamp and the other guy with the stamp and his cousin.
One way to avoid the cheaper dollar is to liberalize imports, but you need to devalue perhaps at a more important velocity, because
otherwise we would just import everything right away because the dollar is so cheap.
No, I don't think so. Another measure that the government needs to take is to reduce public expenditure, but in addition of subsidies.
Yes.
The most important problem within public expenditure you have in salaries.
Okay, so public salaries rather than the subsidies.
Very near 1.2 billions of pesos.
That is a lot of pesos.
It is 4 times bigger comparing with subsidies.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
So
it is not true that the big issue in fiscal side are subsidies. No, it's public expenditures, fiscal salaries.
So essentially what we're looking for then in terms of the dollar, the cheap dollar going forward in 2017 and what impact that should have on Macri's economy is that he should be looking to liberalize imports and address the fiscal deficit, but with more attention on the salaries rather than the subsidies. Do you think he's going to be able to do that?
No, I think that the Macri administration is not going in this direction.
Are we screwed?
Not screwed in the short run, but looking at our history, this fiscal policy is unsustainable. But during this year, we have an election years.
Right.
We have midterm elections, very important for the Macri administration.
Indeed.
I'm not thinking that the government will liberalize imports and will cut expenditure. I think that this year is an election year, it's a political year, so I think that the government will try to insist in the same policies during the last year.
And keep the boat as steady as possible to make it through.
I think that during this year, Argentina will be able to grow very near 3% or 3.5%. Our forecasts are very near in the growth side, with the government. The government in the budgets has forecast 3 to 5%, no, 3.5%. 3.5%. So I think that we we'll be able to grow at this rate during this year. But the inflation rate, I think, will be higher comparing with the target of the central bank.
Right.
The target for the central bank is 17%, and our forecast is very near 25%, 24%.
Well, I will definitely then have to try to get more of the 500 peso notes to save some of the storage space in cash. But anyway, José Luis, thank you very much for coming in, and it's been a pleasure to have you on for Net with
Thank
Bianca.
You. So, thank you for